Welcome to the Dissidents podcast, part of the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can put reason and liberty at the forefront of all human society. In this podcast, Elizabeth Spievak and Mike Burke talk with our fellow co-host Jen Richmond and her friend Winkfield Twyman, better known as Wink, about their new book, Letters in Black and White, a new correspondence on race in America. This book is a culmination of a multi-year email correspondence on the role of race in American society. In this conversation, hopefully the first in a multi-part series, we lay out what it means to be a dissident in an age of mass conformity. Okay, everybody, hello. Welcome to the Dissidents podcast. So we are here with me, Elizabeth, as usual, Jen Richmond, Ren, as she calls herself in the book, which is quite nice, and Wink. And Jen and Wink have just written a new book together. Do you quickly care to introduce the book, Jen or Wink?
Jen, you can take a step.
Okay, I will start. So the book is called Letters in Black and White, and it is a conversation between Wink and myself that lasted over about 4 years. It was before the pandemic, before George Floyd, that we started to write, 2018, 2019 through 2022. And it all started with an essay that I wrote in Ariel magazine with Helen Pluck. Well, I didn't write it with Helen Pluckrose, but when Helen Pluckrose was a part of that, that was about my experience in diversity training in Austin, Texas, to which Wink responded. And I very briefly, I won't go in because I'm sure we'll touch on this, but like Wink responded in the conversation, we responded and spoke at length for months and months, and like these emails that were, they weren't just like highs and buys. I mean, they were letters. And after about like 3 months of us writing, I said, I think like this conversation needs to be shared. I think that we've got something to say. And he thought about it for a second. He goes, yeah, maybe. And it was at that point we really started to put this out in earnest. So it's been about 4 years of our letters. The book itself, the letters are, we mixed up the timeline. They're not, it's not in order. So we kind of do it more by subject than we do by what was written. But for the most part, outside of our grammatical snafus and stuff like that, it is unedited.
If I can chime in, Jen, a little bit.
It's unedited.
When I read Jen's essay, it was like water to a man dying of thirst in the desert. I was so thirsty for something greater in purpose and meaning. I had recently had an exchange with someone that I know. And the person has said to me, in all seriousness, Blackness is oppression. Nothing else matters. And that so discomforted me. It so unsettled me because I had come from a life story and from ancestors for whom that would have been anathema. That would have been hyper-fatalism. That would have been an incomprehensible statement. And so when I read Jen's essay, I felt less alone. I felt aligned with someone else who was misaligned with caricatures and stereotypes in the public square. And so that, go right ahead.
I was just going to say, that's one of my favorite parts of the book is not a part of the book, but that feeling of how much you both needed each other and supported each other. And because I know that feeling that you're talking about, this aloneness, I felt like I woke up one day in a different world, and I don't know how to explain this world that I'm in and this world that hates me and people who dislike me just overnight.
It's astonishing.
And just that
it's astonishing.
Yes. And that love, the love that you share is some of, it's what I get out of, what I got out of Counterweight, what I get out of ILV now is, this is now my safe space. This is now where I come to feel like myself and to feel like the world is still normal. And that's what I got out. Part of what I got out of the book was that, oh, these are the conversations that we're supposed to be having. These are the conversations that real people are.
These are the conversations I would have
I think
in my hometown of Chesterfield County, Virginia in the 1970s. Years closer to Jim Crow, years closer to slavery, in the shadow of Confederate monuments and statues, mere miles from Jefferson Davis Highway. And yet, I never ever felt growing up that I couldn't be authentic in my opinions and viewpoints. No one ever told me, you can't say that. I felt as free could be to express my opinions. Now, you might disagree, but we could disagree without being disagreeable. And where has that gone? That ethos, that wisdom about the human condition, about humanity. And so I'm glad, Elizabeth, that you found that sense of camaraderie and alignment and recognition in the book, because Jen and I, we were aware that 40 million people or 200 million people cannot talk one-to-one and discern reality. But there is hope for an individual across the wide darkness of the abyss to reach out to another individual and to dig deep together, and in that common search, find purpose and meaning for an age of mass conformity. Just my thought.
Thank you. So, okay, with that in mind then, as we kind of discussed before we jumped on the recording, let's try and flesh out our stories so that we can understand our shared humanity, which manifests in individualism. I mean, this is one of the big mistakes, isn't it? You can't have a shared humanity unless you recognize somebody as being an individual human being. Right. Surprisingly, that once common wisdom is somewhat rare. But there we have it. So, Wink, I guess
Sure.
Let's start with you, because you've already kind of gone off a bit on that. Maybe start in, segregated school. How did that feel? What do you remember about that? What do you remember about the transition from segregation to non-segregation? The kind of abuse? How wounding was it? How did it affect your development, or not? How did it encourage you?
Do we have 5 hours? Just teasing. Let me, if I can, frame that maybe in a more streamlined way, and that will prompt further follow-up questions.
Sure.
One of your first questions to me, Mike, was, what made you who you are, or words to that effect? And I thought about that, and I thought, well, 3 things, really. You can think about it in terms of family, place, and time. Family, place, and time. So my family, I grew up on Twyman Road until the age of 8. Everyone on Twyman Road was a relative. My family lived at one side of Twyman Road. Across the street lived Uncle Willie Ernest Sr. and his wife and their 2 kids. And down Twyman Road, lived Uncle Robert Daniel Twyman and his wife, Aunt Juanita, my favorite aunt, and their 4 children. Different ages, different generations. But the point is, until I was 6 or 7 and started school, I assumed the whole world was related to me. My known world was Twyman's. And so I think that gave me a visceral imprint at an early age to walk in the world with confidence, to walk in the world as if the world is related to me. And that's never really left me, that sense of relatedness to the world. Family, all Black. And then place. Yes, I was born in 1961 in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And there were Jim Crow laws in effect. Now, to an outsider, that would suggest that my life was downtrodden and oppressed, that I lived under the weathering heat of segregation, racism, bigotry, discrimination. My soul was corrupted. I internalized inferiority, and woe was me, and my life was stamped from birth or something like that, to paraphrase a book. You know what's interesting, Mike? Until the age of 8, when I attended a desegregated school, I really had no sense of race. I had no, because everyone in my universe was Black. Twyman Road, all Black. Family, all Black. Everyone in my first grade at my segregated elementary school, Hickory Hill, Black. Second grade, everyone was Black. Teachers were Black. The principal was Black. All of my classmates were Black. My church, Ebenezer AME on Terminal Avenue, a Black church, all Black church, founded by my grandma's grandfather. So, in a sense, I was not aware of race in a larger way that sadly little kids today are forced to be made aware of in, say, the first and second grade. I almost was privileged, and that's an odd word to use when you talk about Virginia in the 1960s, but it was a blessing and a privilege to be free of racial dogma and racial self-awareness at such an early age. Because what happened was I learned to think of myself in terms of my humanity, who I was as an individual. What did I like? What did I not like? How did the adults in my life respond to me? So it's all very nurturing, that sense of place. Now, time. Time is the third factor in how I became to be. So in the 1960s, as we know, civil rights laws were enacted. So in 1964, there was the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed segregation of public accommodations. 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which made voting a reality. Although query, I wonder how much of a difference that made in all parts of the South. I've heard rumors that my grandma voted in the 1920s and 30s, which would go counter to the narrative. But, you know, it is what it is. I suspect that there were real barriers in the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, but people tend to lose a sense of nuance when they think about the deep South versus the upper South in the border states. Anyway, in 1968, there was the Housing Rights Act, which outlawed segregation in housing. But all of those things were not known to me. Those were just things happening in the outside world that I was not privy to. What really made a difference, Mike, in terms of time, was the fall of 1969. In the fall of 1969, I encountered my first watershed moment. I went from a child in a 100% Black setting in every way possible to being the only Black kid in my otherwise all-white desegregated school. Now that was a watershed. Each week, I'm sure I was, slurred, made fun of, probably the butt of jokes. A lot of that stuff I've repressed because I just don't remember. And maybe that's a healthy thing. You know, who knows if a hypnosis or therapy would help? No, I don't think so. I think I had my own self-reliance. I was my own therapist. Because I remember one day I sat down at the playground and I thought to myself, why are these people giving me such a hassle? Why are they attributing so much importance to race? And I thought about it because the most important people in my life, as we've discussed, were all Black, from my uncles to grandma to my former teachers to my classmates to my former principal. And I just concluded these people were not intelligent. They were not smart. They were not dumb. And because I prized intelligence very much, from that point on, I concluded these people were just not worthy of my respect or my soul or my spirit. They were just not smart. And that armored me well. That protected me well for the years ahead in desegregation. So those three things, family, place, and time, to a great extent, made me who I am today, which is interesting because in some ways I have children who've been far, far, far more blessed than I am, but yet they seem more defeatist and despair. Why is that? Can you tell me, Mike? Why would someone born in San Diego who goes to top 50 private schools, who goes to some of the best schools in the country, who comes from 4 generations, well, I won't get into all that, but the point is, how does that make sense? And yet I approach life with such engagement, such joy, such purpose, such meaning, such a sense of duty that I owe to my ancestors. It amazes me, Mike. Maybe you have an answer for that.
Okay, Jen in the book mentions the Victimhood Seeking Morality, which is a book by is it Jason Campbell and Bradley Manning, I think, and I don't want to get their names wrong off the top of my head. And
We'll
they
put
talk
it
about
in our notes.
There you go.
Yeah, we'll put it in the notes.
Cool.
What they talk about is you would have grown up, and I think I was at the tail end of this. So I'm 40, so I was at the tail end of this. You and I, perhaps Jen, Elizabeth too, would have grown up in a dignity culture, wherein we were told a falsity. We were told that sticks and stones may hurt our bones, but words will never harm us, which is a description of reality is wrong, because words can hurt a lot more. In my case, very much did hurt a lot more than sticks and stones, or being in a fist fight at school, for example. Being horrendously bullied with words was certainly a lot more traumatic for me than having a fight, which I quite enjoyed, if I'm perfectly honest. But there was a kind of there's a deeper level of truth to that sticks and stones that may hurt my bones. There's a deeper level of truth to it, insofar as it makes sense that as a moral guidance, that there is something divine, a spark of divinity, a spark of individualism within you that stands aside, that cannot be tarnished or corrupted by these external forces, be they verbal, be they physical, be they whatever. That spark of divinity. I love that. And I think that and I think it's us growing up where, because of that moral culture, we recognize that these horrible things were happening to us, but we would nevertheless protect that divine light within us. And you don't have to be religious.
Sure.
You can have that in a purely metaphorical sense, or you could equally have it in a Christian sense. It works both ways. So I think that's what's happened. And I think what's happened now, unfortunately, and what is really letting our kids down, because this correlates with much higher rates of depression, of self-harm, and even suicide, is that we've fallen into this victimhood seeking culture where, your social status, for example, your social status would have been awarded to you for persevering, for holding on to that divine light and running with it and achieving something. And in the book you talk about your ancestors who grew up in where slave catchers were actually a thing, even in the northern states, and you might be cornered and headlocked and and returned to a slave master who would visit all kinds of inhuman punishments that would shock us, even if they were happening in somewhere like China, let alone the United States of today. So that was the world they grew up in, and yet they still had this kind of dignity, which meant that they must go forward and push themselves forward and achieve things in order to show the divine light to other people. Again, from a religious point of view or an atheistic point of view, doesn't matter. So I think we've now moved into this world wherein that doesn't matter, where it's what you're showing to everybody is your trauma. Oh, look how bad things have been for me. Look how much I've suffered. And your moral worth by others is determined by either A, how much you have suffered, or B, and suffering might be real, but often it isn't real. Often it's invented or exaggerated. But I'm not saying it's all fake, because the depression rates are going up. So these people, whether from an objective analysis they're entitled to feel that kind of suffering, well, that's a separate question. But some of it must be legitimate, and even some of it where we might look at it and think, well, Christ, my great-great-great-grandfather, look at what he achieved in spite of all of the adversity in his time. But these kids are on, antidepressants. They are doing self-harm. They are committing suicide. So there is some reality to it.
Part of the problem is that schools and teachers no longer retell the stories of resilience around the campfire, that we're forgetting our stories.
Well, absolutely.
And when we forget our stories, we forget ourselves. And when you forget yourselves, there goes your purpose and meaning in life. You no longer live in duty to, say, a mom's aspiration for you. And that makes it easier then for mass conformity to come into place. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, can I insert some psychology here? So,
I've been waiting for your psychology.
So let's not lose track, because we're talking about lineage, we're talking about, history, and don't lose track of the fact that we evolved in such a way that we are constantly on the lookout for threat, right? So this is what kept us alive for all of these years, right? It's what kept all those family members and their family members before them and before them and before them. And it's what keeps, all, life on earth, basically, alive. So we have never lived in a safer environment, but we have not evolved to live in a safe environment, in the kind of safety. So we can certainly talk about other kinds of danger, but the kind of safety that we're living in now, where things are not coming at us, nothing is going to jump out at us and eat us, right? And so when we're living in this relative safety, our brains are still doing what they were evolved to do, which is to scan the environment all the time for things that are dangerous. And so we're going to find something. I mean, that's what we're designed to do. So I do think that that's an element here where we simply cannot. We can't turn that off, and it would be dangerous to turn that off. Now, unfortunately, what we haven't and are unlikely to evolve to handle is all of the other kinds of environmental threats that like you said, the Twitter mobs and this kind of sort of social danger that we are in all the time, and the exposure that we are seeing all the time. We didn't used to be able to see, just in our lifetimes. We can now see war happening in the moment. We can see people dying in this moment. We can watch George Floyd die on our computer, on our cell phones. We did not evolve for that, right? So what's happening then, I think, is a function of these two things, where we've evolved to scan and protect ourselves from threat all the time, and we are simply not prepared to deal with the kinds of threat, even of social manipulation, in terms of getting us to the grandparent scam, where people are calling grandparents and saying, your kid's in jail and you need to transfer money to me. Those are the kinds of things that people have not evolved to handle. So I do think that's a part of it. And I think that what's happened then, and this is something related to what you talked about in the book, is that a lot of these words you talk about in the book, you talked about sort of the slipperiness of words and slogans. And so that's kind of related to this, right? We're not really evolutionarily prepared to handle some of this sort of like slogan, manipulative kinds of language. But I wonder if you think that some of the language has really actually lost the meaning. So one of the maybe you're a little bit offended by people calling out racism where you don't see it. Maybe racism doesn't mean the same thing, in the same way that anxiety and depression and harm and violence don't mean the same thing anymore. And so, I mean, do you think words have shifted, have lost their meaning, maybe, and that's part of our problem as the dissidents?
That's a great question, and let me kind of come back to that. So I'll cherry pick two words from your question: racism and anxiety, or two of the words you mentioned, racism and anxiety. So for me, I actually don't use the word racism because I try to be more and more careful about the words I do use. To me, racism is state action, governmental action. So, for example, anyone who was enslaved in the 1600s or 1700s, 1800s, well, they suffered racism because they were enslaved due to state action, state enforcement of slave codes. I also think that word's appropriate for those who endured Jim Crow segregation, because once again, states and localities were enforcing laws to segregate based on race in public accommodations and facilities. Makes perfectly good sense. And I even think racism applies to my attendance at an all-black school in first and second grade, because it was the public school system that administered that school, which was a vestige of de jure segregation. So yeah, but I think that those days are long, long ago. What people really mean and care about now is more prejudice, more bigotry, because I see life as individual centric. The individual, in my estimation, is the sovereign. So in 2023, it's more how you engage the world and react to things that you encounter. And that's going to be coming from individuals who may have their misperceptions or who are engaged in caricatures or stereotypes, but it's not state action in the classic sense. So I tend not to use that word. So when I hear that word, I don't want to say my eyes roll. I don't want to say I feel offended. That's a strong term. But I kind of, you sort of
Cringe?
close your eyes and move on because it doesn't make sense. Sometimes people do things that don't make sense. I'll give you a great example. I was in the elevator today coming home for this podcast, and into the elevator walked this man with crazy hair, crazy apparel, talking crazy conversation. And I just thought to myself, okay, I just nodded and humored him. But I certainly didn't think that he was, all there, quote unquote. That's how I view the word racism in the public square. I view it as kind of the crazy guy in the elevator. Okay, you nod and whatever, but it's not reality. Reality is how real people live. Did I offend someone? Sorry. Anyway, moving on. Anxiety. I appreciate anxiety. As I've told Jen, I'm a very anxious person. On my polygenetic score, I love genetics. I'm like at the 99th percentile. So I'm a very anxious person. I'm hardwired that way. I get that totally. So my heart goes out to anyone who suffers from anxiety. But I have found that anxiety for me is not so much a factor of white prejudice or bigotry. To be honest, I face more anxiety sometimes in Black settings from Black people who I don't know, because as you know from the book, there's this weird kind of psychological chasm in Black American culture and consciousness. 76% of Black Americans view their Blackness as extremely important or very important to their sense of self. 24% of Black Americans view Blackness as of no consequence or little import to their sense of self. So what I really find in life, real life, is that I sometimes walk on eggshells because I don't know where the person is who may be a Black American falls on the side of that chasm. Are they someone who's in the 76% and then I have to listen and agree and nod my head? Or in the 24% and I can just click and we can talk and have a serious conversation? I'm thinking of, and Jen knows the person, I met a lovely writer in Chinatown last year. And to my pleasant surprise, she's in the 24%. And we've had the best conversations. And I don't feel like I have to walk on eggshells or present an authentic Black front. I can just be myself with her. But sadly, given that chasm, it's unusual for me to find someone in Black American culture and consciousness who has that same freedom of conscience, freedom of mind, freedom of thought. So to answer your question, I probably find more anxiety in those kind of interactions than I do with non-Black Americans. I'm thinking, for example, as Jen knows, of a distant cousin, a Black cousin, and he's a wonderful person, love him. He's in the 76%, which means what? Which means that when he talks to the three of us, he talks A. But when he talks with me, moments later, he talks B, because he'll say, well, I can't really be authentic in, my workplace, which is all white or whatever. So he's kind of only allows part of himself to be seen in an integrated multiracial setting. And he presumes when he's with me, because I'm a Black American as well, he can let it all hang out. And I get that, but it's also kind of inauthentic. and it wears on me because I enjoy authentic people, Elizabeth. I really do love people who can look at life in all its nuance and complexity. I just am not into racial dogma. It tires me, as you can tell from the book.
I have a very, very funny story to
Okay.
tell you on that. I realized recently that I am bigoted
All right.
against white people. So I live in Japan.
Right.
So I live in Japan, and I'm
Right.
surrounded by Japanese people, and there is a couple who are both white, and they come to the Japanese daycare, and they seem very nice. But I avoided getting to know them because I know that they're middle class and white, and therefore they're likely to be advocates of critical social
that's
justice.
so funny.
Critical social justice fanatics.
That's
And they are, and empirically they
That's
are. When we look
funny.
at the evidence shows that generally black people don't go in for it, ethnic minorities don't go in for it, but white people and highly privileged white people. And if you're going to be living in Japan and you're white, you're likely to be highly privileged because it takes some money to get over there, right? So we didn't talk to each other. I avoided them. Of course it was, hi, how are you? How was your weekend? Oh, that's lovely. We avoided each other, and they avoided me because they thought I might be a critical social justice advocate as well. So we both avoided each other for exactly the same. And then eventually we got talking, and they're like, oh no, I hate all of that stuff.
It's the
So I can completely understand where you're coming from.
I was at a monastery in Big Sur, California. I wanted to go there for years, and we were there. My daughter was with me, and I was at the bookstore, and this white couple were next to me. They were from Canada, and he made certain statements that just presumed I was a far leftist. I presumed I was into the dogma, and I just thought it intrigued me that he would make those assumptions as opposed to getting to know me first as an individual. And I think that's the great crisis of conscience faced by those who are in the 24% and who happen to be Black Americans. We're misperceived, not just by the majority of fellow Black Americans, but also non-Black people as well, who buy into the caricature that Black Americans, must be 90% critical race theorists and far leftists. It's hard. Shelby Still has talked about this. I mean, I think it takes more resilience to be in. I was at Thanksgiving dinner with my lovely family, and I remember this so well. I was my wits end with dogma, and so a particular family member was going on as she usually does, and I asked my family member over Thanksgiving turkey, "Is there an individual in Blackness?" To me, that's a simple question, right? I mean, if there are over 40 million Black Americans, there are over 40 million individuals. Can you believe she actually couldn't answer me? She hemmed, hawed, it's like this screen came over her face. And to me, that's disappointing, but typical. Dogma is so strong that many people can't even voice the obvious, that people are individuals regardless of their race. I'll repeat that. People are individuals first before you're anything else. Like in my own life story, I was an individual on Twyman Road before I learned about race at the age of 8 in the 3rd grade. But yet this intelligent person could not, it was like, does not compute, need to restart, need to reboot the programming. I hate that, and I love it at the same time. It's like a mixed feeling, Mike, because you've got them in the dogma, but they're not going to admit that the thing doesn't make sense. So it is what it is. So I'm having fun. This is good.
All right, Jennifer. This is good. Jen, let's get your story then. The Indian princess, I think, is... God, you wouldn't be allowed to call yourself that anymore, would you? Even though the stereotype was a positive one. Anyway, I've said enough. Please, your story. I think you're on mute, Jen.
Yep. I was
okay.
on mute. Yep.
You're back.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I was making sure no dogs were
no
barking
dogma.
in the background. No dogs or dogma
Pugs
barking
don't do
in
dogma.
my background. But I am laughing about. Okay, so I have to tell you something funny. It's a bit of a tangent, very short. So as all three of you know, my dad recently passed away, and we were cleaning through his closet, and there was a little leather vest with little tassels, and it was like little, and I was like, where did I was like, oh my God, I think this is my Indian princess vest. And my mom's like, yeah, it was. I was like, oh. And we were throwing stuff away or giving stuff away. I was like, this one, because we've written about it. I'm telling my mom, throw that away, throw this away. But I was like, but not the Indian princess vest, which has no other real meaning outside of this story. Which the story is, I grew up. For me, I think I had an atypical American experience insofar as my family was military. And I truly do feel like that is something that's atypical, in the sense that I do feel that a lot of the dogma that we have been captured with, it dissipates in a lot of military settings. There's no room for it. I'm sure I'm wrong. I'm sure there's many people who will tell stories of horrible dogma or racism or prejudice, in these settings, but in the setting that we lived in, it just simply wasn't in our storyline. And so I grew up, my father's best friend. My father was one of the first graduates of the Air Force Academy. His best friend was one of the first 4 Black graduates. That was his best friend who throughout his life, and his family was with my family. As a matter of fact, his family was at my father's funeral last month. That's how close we've been throughout our life. And so I know, I do recognize that I had a filter on my life that was not your average filter. But what really then struck me is, as someone who went from this military family to living overseas, where I was literally I was the minority in most scenarios, and I loved it. I love being different. I love being asked about like where you're from and what do you love, and like I thought that was so much fun, and that's what like gave life meaning. To then come back and study that all my life, and to come back with this vision of America as this like kind of multicultural mecca, if you will, and to find that we had like just kind of torn that apart, was a little bit shocking to me. And that's what started. So really, what started my journey down this road was not race, it was polarization. And then as I started to study polarization, and as I started to turn my international relations like kind of lens on the United States, I saw most of the polarization was around race. And that's really where the story began, where I was like, well, I came at it with pure intention, with genuine naivete, where I was just like, I don't know what we're talking about. So I went to this diversity training. Again, not to like do a getcha or a got ya or like to make any statement. I was like, at this time, this was pre George Floyd. This was 2018, 2019. It was before anything, it really became an issue. But I was like, if I'm going to, again, genuine intention, if I'm going to research this, I'm going to understand people's experiences. So I literally went in it thinking that I was going to get to hear other people's voices and just come out enlightened. And as you read in the book, it was everything but. And that's the beginning of our story, where all of a sudden it was like, where Wink will say blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. This diversity training was whiteness is like everything, like, and it was like, name your whiteness in every place, but whiteness was everywhere. It was like whiteness is in anger, whiteness is in love, whiteness is in hate. I was like, how is this like? It wasn't making sense to me, and that's where I kind of said, this doesn't work. The way we're trying to like group colors.
Do you think that do you think that the attendees, not the facilitator, but were the attendees still able to recognize reality from what they were being tossed in the diversity training? Really?
No.
Really? They didn't just assume this is a bunch of hogwash.
I told you.
Oh my, that's scary, because that shows a total break with reality.
No, not at all. You know the story. Oh yeah. No, I mean there's stories in the book of short little anecdotes at least of my white group, where I was sitting there in awe of what people were throwing out as what was whiteness. And I was just like, yeah. And then remember when I did
Yeah,
say
yeah,
my piece, when I did kind of
right.
stand up and say, hey, I'm not sure this is working for me, like people were like, oh, you know, like I was.
The reason I ask my
was the
question,
bad guy
Jen,
for the
is
rest of
sometimes
the.
people engage in performance art so that they can show they're more virtuous than thee. So sometimes people may not believe it, but they want to score points because they see the direction which the dogma is going. But you're saying your sense is that they authentically believed what they were saying.
Okay, so Wink, I
Okay.
can't answer you specifically. I will say this is before. Again, remember
Right,
this is
right.
before like George Floyd. This is before the pandemic, where I think it was more important. The virtue signaling became heightened. So was there virtue signaling? Was there performance art there? Perhaps. But at that time in our history, I didn't feel it as necessary as I did later. And yet it was so a part of this. So was it performance art or was it genuine, authentic guilt? I would say people genuinely, authentically bought
And that brings
the
me
story.
And that's a great question. I mean, what is authenticity? What is authentic? For example, Mike and Elizabeth, I have a distant cousin, Jen knows, who has raised questions. Am I authentic? Am I an authentic Black person? What are your thoughts on that? Can an authentic Black person have the life story that I have, or am I living in a simulation, as on the Star Trek deck?
Look, I mean, I wrote an article. I wrote an article
Right.
for Aereo a while back on this, on a mistake that was being made by people on the left and the right with regards to Islam. So the people on the left, they'll point to some community of genuinely nice, well-behaving Muslims taking care of their elderly neighbors, doing all these good things, and they exist. They're real. And then they'll cherry pick certain verses from the Quran that are also benign, and they'll say, look, this is the authentic Islam. Now, Al-Qaeda exists, but that's the inauthentic Islam.
Gotcha.
Then the right will make the same mistake, right? So the right will point to Al-Qaeda and people who are doing all of these awful things, or ISIS, lopping off heads, pushing homosexuals off buildings, and then they'll cherry pick other verses from the Quran, and they'll say, well, look, this is the authentic Islam. Well, my point of view is that the idea of authenticity is complete nonsense, right? They're both authentic because the people believe it to be true, right? If a person believes they're authentic, they are authentic. But this idea that you can have, this idea that you could project, and this is where I object, this is where I think authenticity becomes oppressive. As soon as you start to say, well, I have this idea of what an authentic Black person is, and the one that worries me the most is that it's the inner city identity. Which would seem to be from the outside, the one that is being pushed by pop music, by hip hop music, would seem to be something like, well, the authentic Black identity is somebody that doesn't go to school, doesn't read books, that favors street, and again, I'm not sure what street means, but favors street knowledge, and participates in violence and
not Jack and Jill, not Martha's Vineyard, not second generation,
not Jack and Jill, not Jack and Jill. Right. Well, I mean, but maybe, you know, I would actually view that as oppressive as well. If they're saying that the authentic Black experience, I mean, not as oppressive, obviously, but if they're saying that the authentic Black experience has to be Jack and Jill, which I could assume, I don't know, but from reading the book seems to be quite repressive and very kind of English, for lack of a better word, would I say. Yes, well, lots of small talk. How's your wife's cousin? Did you have a nice game of bridge today? It reminded me of my grandmother. It just reminded me of my grandmother. And I know that was very stuffy for me. And so I thought when I was imagining Jack and Jill, maybe I'm wrong. That's how it came across to me. That's what I thought it would be, a very kind of buttoned up.
So I would like
not
to
as oppressive, but yeah. So carry on, Elizabeth, please.
Well, I'd like to propose that one of the problems is that maybe all of us think of authenticity in terms of being true to oneself.
Yes,
quite.
Maybe having sort of an inner sense of integrity that's guiding us and that kind of thing. But there are legitimately other ways to, at least from a psychological standpoint, to consider authenticity. And one of them is the degree to which, we'll say an item for the purposes of this discussion, then we'll go to people, fits in a category. Okay. So, is a penguin a bird? Is a Tesla a car? Is an ostrich a bird? So there's like technically yes, but so in terms of psychology, we would sort of draw a diagram where we have maybe an exemplar bird that would be, say, a robin in America, but maybe it would be something else. Well, actually, around here, maybe it would be a seagull. When I ask my students what an exemplar bird is here on the coast, they choose a seagull, which I thought was really weird because being a Midwesterner, I'm like, that's an exemplar bird. So an ostrich would be quite far away from that category of bird, if that makes sense, as would a penguin, where something quite close, something closer would require less cognitive energy to sort of answer that question. Is a penguin a bird? It's like, wait, I have to think about that for a second, right? Is a wagon a vehicle? I have to think about that, right? Where other times, so there's like some sort of, psychology in here. How easy is it for me to fit you into the category is also a version of authenticity. And I think that's what is it your cousin? That's what your cousin is maybe objecting to. And he or she is thinking about authenticity in a different way. And from that standpoint, you shouldn't be offended. You should be like, you're right. I am not offended in that way.
Good point.
It's like I am further from your sort of overly minimalistic definition of what it means to be Black. And that's okay with me because that's part of what makes me authentic to me and to the people who love me and care.
But what's funny, Elizabeth, and you will appreciate this as a psychologist, my personality type is INFP, introverted, intuitive, feeling, perceptive, which means that one of my driving motors in life is authenticity. So what's interesting is that of all the personality types, I'm probably the person most likely to reject your well thought out suggestion because I really do see it from the inside out, right? As opposed to the outside in. Does that make sense?
Well, absolutely. I'm not suggesting that you should think about authenticity differently. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying that there is more than one definition of authenticity. And I suspect that you yourself have more than one definition of authenticity for other aspects of your life. So we are situationally, even our personality varies by situation. So certainly our cognitions about things and the fit of certain things vary depending on on our situation. So
I think Elizabeth, if I can follow up, I think it's particularly challenging for someone who is an INFP to thrive in mass conformity times, in a time of mass conformity and dogma and what have you. Do you agree with that or not?
Well,
if I may, Elizabeth, this sounds like the perfect time to tell your story.
Segue.
I think that will. No, I think that it will answer your question in the kind of context that it needs. Maybe.
I don't know if it will. I don't know if it will or not. So, do you just mean the story of how I came to be a dissident?
Yes. I love those stories, Elizabeth.
So, yeah. Well, so I guess I should say my trajectory, is also very uneven. My undergraduate degree is in quantitative
Oh.
business analysis and operations and systems, and I got an MBA in
Mhm.
decision sciences. And I went to work in industry and hated it. I mean, I threw up every morning. I weighed,
Yes.
it was horrible. And one of the things that I hate about it is some of the things that we're talking about here: the
Mhm.
inauthenticity, the overemphasis on the short-term
Mhm.
P&L statement, and just
Yeah.
get those widgets out the door. We don't
Yeah.
care about the quality and that kind of stuff. So I sort of by accident became unemployed in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and ended up wandering around, sort of, with my hat in my hand. I walked into Wright State University and said, yesterday I had a job, today I don't have a job, and you got anything for me? And they hired me to teach in the business school, even though I only had a master's, just like a
Mhm.
1 credit experiential course. And while I did that, I could go to school for free. So I got a master's in English. And so here I was, this math nerd who, got a master's degree in English, and I wanted to get a PhD in English, and they rejected me. A few schools heard that I was going to apply, and they mailed me a rejection letter, I think, even before they got my application. So I did do a little stint after I taught. I realized I was really liking academia. I actually went over and worked at
Okay.
Wilberforce University, which is an
Yes. One of the
HBCU,
oldest.
near there. Yes, and I worked there for a little while in grants and sponsored projects, and started applying to PhD programs again. Only this time more in my field, in organizational psychology. The only place I got accepted was where I went, and I went there to study decision making and, again, organizational psychology. I thought that I would end up in a business school, and I fell in love with cognitive psychology. So it was kind of an accident. And then I ended up out here in New England after September 11th, when the private school I was teaching at, got in trouble after September 11th. And I thought, I was just so grateful to be here. I had never lived by the ocean. Now I jog on the beach, and I was in this very progressive, very liberal area. I felt very much at home here, and I spent all of my time teaching
Yeah.
and doing research with undergraduates, and just poured myself into it. I've never had any kids, and those are my babies, and took them all over the country, presented. They got into PhD programs from this little state school where I teach. And I was this big fish in a small pond. I really was, because I built this uh, big, really, lab, and at a school that really had never done research the way that I was doing it before. And then and it was a very diverse lab, usually 7 to 10 students, all shapes, sizes, and varieties. It never really even occurred to me. It's just not something that I really thought about. And then we were doing research on rhetoric. This was same time that you all, that Jennifer went
Mhm.
to the diversity thing and everything. And my students were interested in the way that people were talking about race, and then also about, well, previously it would have been about terrorism. So I had a Egyptian student, and she was interested in terrorism. She had done 4 years of research on metaphors of terrorism. And when we had September 11th, we had George Floyd, and we had COVID, and she said, I'd like to do this in relation, these same metaphors in relationship to COVID and Black Lives Matter. And so that's what we did. We designed an experiment. We collected data from over 400 participants. And a student, we were collecting data sort of as a favor to the department. We didn't need the data. So it's just kind of all this confluence of events. A student was taking the survey online. So these students got an orientation to research in a department that has redesigned their curriculum to focus on research. Got an orientation to research, signed up for a platform, chose a study, read a consent document, answered about 100 questions on a survey. There was a question in 1/4 of the participants saw a question that was negative. 2 words were negative about Black Lives Matter, not about a person, not about any individual, but about the movement. Okay. And its effect on a community. So not its effect on a person, but the movement's effect on a community. And the idea was they were interested in how would people vote to spend money in their community. So we had COVID and we had Black Lives Matter framed in either a positive or less positive light, and how would people vote to spend money in their community. By the way, we found what you might expect, that Democrats or left-leaning people were wanted to punish people who did not comply with COVID-19 rules and regulations, right? They wanted to punishment, fine,
Sure.
imprison, arrest, whatever. And the opposite was true, so anyway, it really doesn't matter what we found, because a student took a screenshot of the Black Lives Matter movement negative, connotation, and posted it on the university internal website and on Twitter. And 24 hours later, I was done. So my lab is shut down. My students got death threats. Interesting. It was 2 white students that week, because everybody's job was to run all of the studies. So nobody owned a study. We were all in it. That was one of the things that, I really instilled on them. The work comes first. We may not always like each other every minute of every day, but we always respect the work. And so, unfortunately, it was 2 white men that got canceled. Of course, it would be. So in the weeks that followed, in that uncertainty, many tears, of course, and panic, and you really do think that people are going to get it. It's going to go away, right? Like, it can't be this crazy. You really do think that people are going to figure it out. And 18 years of me even I was actually the chief compliance officer. I was the institutional review board chair for 11 years. They canceled, they basically destroyed the IRB. They gutted the IRB. So it wasn't long after that I just started sending emails. I sent emails to the Weinsteins. I sent emails to, I just like all over I was just like, help, I don't know what to do. I don't know where I don't know what to do at all. And it was actually probably one of their kids, the Weinstein's kids, who actually answered me and said, we get too many of these emails. We can't help you. Go to Counterweight.
That's good.
And I emailed Counterweight, and within hours I had a Zoom meeting with Helen. And so now this is where I pour all my energy, all that energy that I was pouring into my students, the love that now when I'm in the classroom, I forget about it, but the rest of my life is really consumed by that one screenshot. And this is, I still don't understand how that happened, but I just know that I still feel like I have something to contribute, and I know that I can't do it there anymore. And so I hope that this will be a place where I can still make a difference and contribute to young people and to people like us who are lost.
That's a moving story. It reminds me a little bit of Professor Roland Fryer and his tale at Harvard. Yeah.
Yes.
And Jody Shaw.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jody Shaw, of which, by the way, so that actually, Wink, if you don't mind, that brings me to something that I want to kind of mention. It's a tangent in a way, but I feel like there's so much richness in what we're talking about here. I'm going to suggest that I run with this tangent, and maybe we do a follow-up on this, because what Elizabeth just was talking about now is what I think the heart of ILV is. And that's not really about the book Wink, but for all of our listeners who are listening to this, Wink has been with me starting ILV. But Wink, what you haven't seen is Elizabeth and Mike have been like the backbone of everything that we've been doing. And they have their own stories, as you heard from Elizabeth. And the reason I kind of want to introduce ILV and then maybe have this conversation again, not only about the book, but then have Mike introduce his conversation, is we all came here, including you and I, Wink, in this series of true dissidents, of truly trying to find a place of where we can have these conversations that aren't always pretty. And that was what's so lovely about Wink and I. I mean, he and I did not agree. Like, if you read the book,
true.
there are times that and I'll tell you, we actually like even smooth some things out, like through our writing that weren't smooth always, like in our emails. I was like, I mean, there was days that we like just wouldn't, I mean, it was like, it was just true, right? We wouldn't like, we'd have to take a minute before we talk to each other, but like, this is what it's all about. And so I love the story that we're not just talking about Letters in Black and White, but talking about ILV, because ILV is Jodi Shaw. It is Letters in Black and White. It is your story, Elizabeth. It is your story, Mike, that I think that we need to tell again in another podcast. It's all the stories of people who have found themselves shut out from a genuine, or as we were talking about, authentic, whatever that may mean, conversation.
I mean,
so to me, this is truly the Dissidents. It's not about our book. It's about
the four of us, we are the descendants. We're the ideological descendants of Justice John Marshall Harlan. He was the lone justice to dissent in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. So in 1896, there's this mass conformity dogma throughout the land, race segregation, 2 thumbs up, let's do it, way to go. One lone man, one lone justice from Kentucky saw that, this doesn't make sense. This is incongruent. How is it equal protection under the law to separate people based upon race? And so despite social pressures in 1896, nonetheless, he had the courage and the insight and the fortitude and the resilience and the vision to write A Descent for the Ages. And I think in many ways, we now carry his mantle. We recognize the imperfections in the prevailing dogma, but the things that we write and say and believe, I think will win out over the long run. That's my feeling.
Can I give another individual? Have you heard of August Landmesser? So you know the picture, right? I think it's during one of the Nuremberg rallies.
Yes.
And there's all of these people, and they're all Sieg Heiling. And there's that one guy who's just
Yes.
That's him. I'd say that, great, huge, precious to social conform. And he just said, no, this is all bollocks. I'm not having any of it. Continued to stand up for Jewish people and paid the ultimate price, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, let's do this again. The only thing I would like to point out is that it's not all doom and gloom,
that's
right? And this is one of the wonderful, and thank you for this, Wink, by the way. This is one of the wonderful things that I got through your example after example after example after example of these people, some of your ancestors. And it feels like I'm not black, and I'm certainly not American, not even remotely. And yet that feels like it's part of my story now, because I can think about these people who went through that, who fought against not just enormous social pressure, but the actual threat of physical violence, of real physical violence, of murder, and of being killed in particularly inhumane ways as well, and went on nevertheless to make massive successes of themselves.
Why do we forget their stories, Mike? Why do we forget their stories?
So this is one of the questions I asked. This is one of the questions I asked you in the email that we sent out, and with loads of questions, which clearly we can't squeeze into one podcast.
It doesn't fit the narrative.
But
it doesn't fit the message.
You said, look, right. Well, as you said, look, there were 2 narratives.
Yes.
There was the abolitionist narrative and there was the slave narrative.
Right.
And only one of them could win. And clearly, It is a historical fact that the abolitionist narrative won out, not just in America, but also in the British Empire as well. When the British Empire went around enforcing it and telling other countries, no, sorry, you don't get to make your own rules. We will enforce this upon you too. So the abolitionist narrative clearly won out. That's a historical fact. And yet so many of us seem to act as if
what's that about, Mike? How does that make sense?
It's bizarre. What is it about? Well, I would go back to the victimhood seeking culture. I would, people are desperate to show their social status, but relative to how much of a victim they are.
But you can't rewrite history, Mike. That is like the ultimate disrespect. That is like the ultimate disrespect to rewrite history. I don't want to hammer on the 1619 Project yet again. But I just really think that we have to push back and speak out and write against efforts to reframe American history. And you know why? Because the real American history we have is good enough. It's quite inspiring. You can find some of the most noble, epic examples of duty and courage and wisdom throughout the American past in all races. So it doesn't do to disrespect our past and just say, well, America is just a tiny frame of reality. It's all about racism as the foundation of the American experiment. It's almost like a hypnotist. Nicole Hannah-Jones is almost like a hypnotist to the degree that she focuses the attention of the reader on a very narrow slice of American history. And any other non-conforming opinions or views are erased and replaced, to use Eric Smith's terminology. And I just think it's just dreadful. And you also see that, I'm really going to talk, you also see that in, I think, too many Black American families. On Ancestry.com, let me back up. 0% of American Black people have no white ancestors. 0%. So whenever you see a Black American, you're looking at someone who really is multicultural in their heritage. And yet I would say maybe half, if not a slight majority of Black Americans, fail to just accept that as just reality, just as part of the past. I'm always amazed at that. I remember the descendant, the Black descendant of Thomas Jefferson, caught a lot of heat on Black Twitter because he participated in an Ancestry.com commercial, which celebrated the Declaration of Independence with many races. In other words, you had all the different races of the descendants, the actual framers in Independence Hall. And some people thought, well, that's just perpetuating white supremacy. How could you do this? Blah, blah, blah. It's just abominable. Just utterly abominable. It is a beautiful thing, I think, that Thomas Jefferson, the wordsmith of the Declaration of Independence, probably has more Black descendants than white descendants. I think that's a beautiful American thing. I really do. And I think that should be celebrated. I really do. That's just me.
So we're going to do another one of these, I hope, if you're up for that.
You guys are great.
But in the meantime, oh, thank you so much. We feel the same, I'm sure. I want to ask you one last question, Wink, just to end on. So how do you reconcile... It's just a silly thing that came up from the book, but I can't resist. So how do you reconcile Cousin Bobby?
Cousin Bobby, it's just a historical quirk, right? It's one of those things. I don't.
It's fabulous,
in the book, I talk about that with Jen. I mean, I think that we all have ancestors and blood kin that are saints and sinners, and there's a spectrum, and that you're more complete as a person, Mike, if you accept all of the threads that make you who you are, right? That's my belief. So, but for the Lee family, I wouldn't be a living, breathing person because I wouldn't have those chromosomes or genes that make me who I am. I wish more people would accept their complete genetic past. We would be happier as a people, I think. As opposed to walking through life thinking, I can only respect half of my genome or 3/4 of it, and I just must pretend the rest didn't happen. Yeah. So such silliness, such nonsense. That's just me, though.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll finish this one for this week, and
Cool.
we'll reschedule something else, and let's continue, because this has been a lot of fun.